Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being this afternoon with us in the third Go Just seminar. I have the great pleasure and also the honor to introduce you a close friend of our program, of mine, Graham Dutfield, world leading scholar in intellectual property studies from a critical point of view. Graham is a well-known scholar in studying traditional knowledge, the intersection of law and knowledge, both from the indigenous people point of view, but also from global incumbent players and institutions. He has worked on agri-food, on intellectual property and medicine, and the pharmaceutical industry. His books are well received, both from his peers, but also from a wider audience. Graham is a great supporter, as I said, of the department and of our events and initiatives. He has lectured several times in the University of Athens and in our department, and he always very keen to accept my invitation. So I would like to thank him very much for accepting this invitation. And today he is speaking about his book that he is working on, which is on traditional knowledge, and the title of the talk is Lifeworld, Landscape and Law, from Territoriality to Rights in Knowledge, a topic and a theme that Graham has been really a very major contributor in the scholarship, and he has contributed both with books and articles, but also by teaching this topic in the undergraduate and postgraduate programs of the law school in Leeds, where he is professor the last couple of years. So thank you once more, Graham. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is with you.
Thank you very much. So first, you may be wondering why the three words here all begin with the letter L. I suppose it might be because I like alliteration. I like words all starting the same letter in one phrase. But actually, there is a more serious reason, and I hope that will become more apparent in due course. Some of you may, and some of you may not be aware that in the last 2 weeks, there's been a conference in Geneva taking place with a view to finalizing the draft of an international treaty on which concerns the genetic resources and associated traditional knowledge. Now, this association between the traditional knowledge and genetic resources and IP, intellectual property law, I think in a way requires some kind of, I think, an explanation. Why do we talk about this in the context of intellectual property? It's not an obvious thing, and I think that is in some ways hinted at in the subtitle, From Territoriality to Rights in Knowledge. Now, I think it's fair to say that safeguarding traditional knowledge is of utmost importance to Indigenous people, and so wider appreciation of this is reflected in these current efforts to draft this treaty. But I have to say that Indigenous peoples are in the back of the room, if they're there at all. They're not involved in the actual negotiations on the textual negotiations. Although it is also true that I know Australia this week has about 3 Indigenous people on their delegation, so they're not completely excluded, but inclusion is less satisfactory than it should be. So intellectual property forms almost exclusively the framing of the discussion on whether and how such knowledge should extend to legal protection. Now, what I think Indigenous people want, and of course we're talking about millions of people around the world who have their own customs, their own rules, and they have their own demands. But as a generalization, I think it's fair to say that what they want most is territorial recognition plus control over that which emanates, which comes from that territory, both tangible and intangible. And hence knowledge comes in that. So this relationship between knowledge and land and territory is extremely important. But protection of knowledge without that link with territoriality simply sort of doesn't really work in their particular way of understanding and seeing the world. All right. Okay. So let me just go to the next page. Okay. So that's certainly okay. I'm trying to change page here. It's not actually working. Let me see what's happening here. I'm trying to change the page. I better just stop this and try it again, because that didn't. There seemed to be a problem with actually changing the page. If I can't change the page, don't worry. We don't need the slides. It's possible to do this without them. But I'll try again. Okay, now it's working. I don't know what's happening before. So okay, so 2 questions just really to get started here, having just briefly introduced the theme. Why do we envisage the problem of Indigenous knowledge as one related to intellectual property and to be solved in that legal form? And what alternative approaches might work better? And it's the second question, which is the shorter one, which is one I would like to spend a bit more time on. I think I found lots of nice quotes, but these 2 quotes I think are very interesting. One by someone called Rhys Jones, who is an Australian archaeologist. And he said the most discussions and contrast is made between a natural environment as opposed to an artificial one. We imply the former represents the climax. They're talking about ecosystems without the effects of man. And as examples of it, we might think of bushland around our cities, national parks, and remote areas. We imagine the country seen by the first colonists to Australia before they rebarked or they killed the first tree was natural, but was it? Okay. Now, as you're very well aware, and there's lots of philosophical tradition out of which these ideas come from in our part in Europe, in our part of the world. We draw this sort of distinction between what is culture and what is nature. We create these sort of dualisms. There's also us as people. We sort of, in a way, we take ourselves out of nature and we look in nature as if it's something out there, but we're not inside it. And this is a kind of ontology. It's a kind of the way that we view and understand reality. And it is one that actually very much comes from our culture. So Rhys Jones, he wrote this quite a long time ago, but basically he's trying to understand that this is our view, but in a sense, from the perspective of Indigenous Australians, they have a completely different perspective. And I want to show how that really, really matters. But I need to do that, I need to go into a little bit of the detail. And then Margot Neal, who's an Indigenous person, also from Australia, says this: the notion that Western law comes primarily from humans and our ancestors, and that it was written in something as disembodied and dislocated as books, and then placed in buildings, has nothing to do with the stories of law within that land. It's unfathomable. It is impossible to understand in the Aboriginal worldview. Aboriginal law is written in the land. It is as ancient as it is permanent. Law and culture are inseparable. One is the other. And country holds all knowledge as an integrated whole, not compartmentalized into separate disciplines. Okay, that's quite a lot to actually think about there. So first, she is saying for them, they're not kind of anthropocentric in terms of law. And law is not something that is recorded in book. It is living, and it is actually part of land. So not only is this sort of dualism between culture and nature being sort of it collapses here from their particular perspective, but also this idea that law and land are two different things. They are, in a way, inseparable. It's a very hard idea for us to probably get our heads around. But the point to make here is that what seems common sense and logical for them seems to us anything but. But it also works the other way around. Right. Okay. All right. So understanding that the concept of landscape. Landscape and land. So why am I talking about landscape? Well, landscape is a term that originally comes, I think, from the aesthetics of art. You talk about landscape painting, but landscape was used. It started to become commonly used by geographers in the early 20th century. Carl Sauer, among others, United States, and he talked about cultural landscapes. And since then, there's been a bit of tradition of geographers, but also anthropologists investigating this concept of landscape as something that is, even if there are no obvious traces of human transformation, it is more likely that there has been some other historic or perhaps also present transformation of that landscape that is undetectable. But beyond that, landscape is also imbued with sort of spirituality of kinds that if you are not steeped in that particular culture, you simply wouldn't know it's there, and you wouldn't have any kind of understanding or appreciation of it. But actually, so what's happened in the sort of 1980s is that anthropologists and ethnobiologists started to look at land which seemed to be the least affected by humans, and started to realize that there are certain areas that are actually domesticated, not at the level of the individual plant or the species, but the whole ecosystem is itself actually domesticated. So you find that there are geographers, anthropologists, along with historians, actually historical ecologists and archaeologists. They start to come together, and they start to see that this landscape they thought was wild and pristine is anything but. So I'm particularly looking at Australia and the Amazon, because the similar questions actually arise as we'll see. So landscape. So a lot of the work on understanding the domestication of landscapes, which takes place in the 1980s and into the 90s, the early work, was done. Some of those people who did that work were among the first to start talking about protecting this knowledge, safeguarding their knowledge. But it was based on investigation of land first. So we start off with land, and of course, this demand for land rights goes back a very long period of time, back 100, 200 years actually, or to the Spanish conquest of America. So you find that this this link between land and knowledge starts to sort of emerge as some of these people doing the science become actually active supporters of Indigenous people. Okay. Now, I'll come back to that point in a moment. But what about this term life world? Well, one could say that law, the way we do law itself, as you understand, is an expression of a particular sort of worldview. And I quite like this term worldview, but a number of anthropologists have started to talk about life world. Why do they use the word, this term life world? Well, what is their understanding of life world? Well, I have got a nice quote here from somebody called Teresa Miller. So Teresa Miller is an anthropologist. She did work in the Amazon in the state of Maranhão, and she wrote this book called Plant Kin, like kinship, and she writes about how the indigenous people in this particular area of the Amazon treat plants, the plants they cultivate, as members of their family. So they actually literally as members of the family. They, in a sense, extend their family relations not just beyond their own community, but beyond actually human life to plant and animal life as well. And so she talks about the life world, which she says, relational pathways between and among humans and non-humans that evolve over time and in distant places. To which I would add, for many indigenous peoples, such that these life worlds may involve experiences and meanings that involve some or all of the following separately or otherwise: people, plants, animals, the supernatural entities, land types, villages, soils, and particular sort of geographical locations, particular physical things, hills, mountains, rock formations on the landscape. And they see these as forming sites of cultural and spiritual kind of importance to them, which may also perhaps have to do with their own creation narrative. So we're talking about people who have relations with life beyond the human, which are like family relations. We're talking also about this connectedness, cultural and spiritual, between people and land, which is something that most of us would find very, very hard to actually comprehend. We split these things up. We create these sort of dualisms, and we separate the two out. And our own law is based, and sometimes it's very obvious that we do this, is based on certain sort of dualism. So we have, like, in patent law, okay, we talk about, is this a natural product? Is it a discovery, or is it an invention? And sometimes, and we try to do this in as logical way as we can. Sometimes we do this by creating legal fictions. So we know this is not quite working, but we create legal fictions in order to make the law clear and actually usable, and also provide legal certainty. So we do create these sort of dualisms. Now, indigenous peoples also have their dualisms as well, but not the same ones. All right. So it's, so in a sense, I have allegiance to my own worldview, as we all probably do. But at the same time, I also know that my own worldview is completely alien to people who are steeped in a life world of relations which have nothing to do, which have no place at all for our own sort of dualism. So I think it's incredibly important. And I came up with this term, ontological totalitarianism, which is probably maybe a bit too strong, but maybe I'm just trying to be a little bit sort of provocative. So in a sense, we tend to think that the way we think is the only correct way to think. And it's incredibly sort of like harsh, if you think about it, that we have imposed this on people through conquest, basically. And it's Van Shiva uses the term monoculture of the mind, in a sense, that is kind of what we have been doing to other people. And it's not just that we took their land, we Europeans, but British are among the worst offenders, the Spanish as well. But not only do we took their land, but we even said, look, everything you believe in is completely, totally primitive. It's obsolete. It is useless. It is wrong. And so you can see why they have these massive social problems. So the communities in Australia, there's problems of alcoholism and domestic violence, social breakdown, and it's really very, very tragic. It's like saying everything you know, everything you believe is wrong. And so how do you fit into a society where everything your ancestors told you over 1,000 years, they've been there for 65,000 years, they say in Australia, everything, your whole tradition on which your knowledge, understanding is based, is completely worthless. It is worth absolutely nothing. And it's not hard to understand how incredibly sort of destructive this is. So my feeling is that somehow this kind of totalitarianism needs to be broken down, that we need to find space for other ways of viewing the world. And in some ways, efforts have been made, there's no doubt about it, but at the same time, we can do so much better. And all right, so going back to the 1980s, so I'm shifting between, in a sense, question one and question two, which might be hard to follow. I hope not too much, but I just think it makes the conversation a bit more sort of lively. So back in the 80s, then, including my own sort of mentor, Darryl Posey, who was an Amazonist. That's what he did, but also was a political campaigner. So he and others were sort of documenting the value of knowledge of Indigenous people, which up to this point was seen as being worth nothing, absolutely worthless. The only reason why it was worth recording was because other these people or their knowledge was actually going extinct. Salvage ethnography, that's what I called it. So I would say there's sort of 6 areas where people were writing with much more respect about this knowledge. 6 areas. One is sort of subsistence and ecosystems management practices. That was one thing, and people like Darryl Posey were doing that sort of work. They were showing that this sort of domestication of ecosystems was something that was actually present and was actually making their lives much more livable in very difficult, hostile environments. Second, local cultivated plant varieties and agricultural practices generally, which turned out to be less wasteful and more efficient than people had assumed up to that point, because this idea that the only kind of agriculture that is agriculture is permanent farming on particular areas of land. And I'll come back to them shortly. The third is sort of practices and products, including plant and animal preparations used to satisfy health and nutritional needs. So health and foods and nutritional needs. So that kind of knowledge as well. And the fourth, I have, actually, I said 6, but I think I mean 5. Applications that relevant to biotechnology, including drug discovery. Now, of course, of those 4, I'll add economic development as well. But that one I just said about biotechnology and drug discovery, that's the one where everybody stands up and says, "Oh, now that is interesting," because that's about money, right? So now, what else was happening in the 1980s was that you had this sort of, we starting I think to use the terms of globalization. There's trade talks aimed at reducing barriers to trade globally, but there's also this idea increasingly that about talking about the sort of knowledge economy, the knowledge society, right? and you all may also be aware in the 80s we had this GATT talks, the Uruguay round, and intellectual property. So countries more and more seeing that in order to compete, we're competing on knowledge, and of course we want to have IP rights, patents in order to grow our economy and compete better with other countries. Of course, that time the United States was finding competition in high-tech goods from Japan, South Korea, the Asian tigers. So increasingly, much of trade demands were dressed up in terms of knowledge. We started to make this, start to have personal computers. Well, the internet, early days, it was really in the 90s you get internet, but things are starting up. So it's hardly surprising that the discourse of intellectual property becomes more and more common. And so, of course, when these indigenous peoples, anthropologists, and ethnoecologists, and so on, started to say, look, this knowledge is sort of valuable. It's almost inevitably that governments go, well, surely this is a sort of intellectual property issue. And that's, of course, what happens. But that also means that while that's politically quite useful in some ways to address your demand, because now you can go and speak in these high-level forums and say, look, our interest in our knowledge in the rainforest or in around the world or wherever, our knowledge should be part of the conversation. And that, of course, in a way, is a good thing. The problem, because it raises the profile. The problem is you are disconnecting knowledge from things like territory and land. You make a sort of disconnect. So there's a positive side and a negative side. A two-edged sword, or two sides of the coin. So it raises the profile. But at the same time, it also rather limits what can possibly be achieved. And of course now, as things are sort of negotiated in places like Geneva, which is a very white European city, you're far and far away from those people who are supposed to stand to benefit. Okay, all right. Just to sort of illustrate the things that I'm trying to say, this question of what is natural. So Darryl Posey, who I worked with back in the 90s, and we did this book together called Beyond Intellectual Property. We haven't calling it Beyond. Even those days, we thought we needed to go beyond IP law. And that book came in 1996, and that was, I think, the first monograph actually written on this subject. As far as I know, there it was, published in 1996, Darryl Posey and me. So Darryl was working many years with the Kayapo in the Amazon, and he said now he came up with this idea that there are certain areas of grassland in the Amazon, and they're little these forest islands, and he claimed, and although some people, it's a bit debatable. There has been some kind of opposition to this view, but he thinks that these forests are anthropogenic. They were made by people. They actually are. It's a sort of cultivated islands of forest. And he said, of course, they look natural, and they were not recognized as being human artifacts. But he said up to 75% could actually have been planted. And he uses ecological engineering. It requires to do this, you required detailed knowledge of soil fertility, microclimatic variation, and species niches, as well as the interrelationship among species that are introduced into these human-made communities. So these are, according to him, human-made. Now, whether he is right or wrong about this, what is almost certainly true, because since he did that work in the 1980s, since that time, there is more and more evidence that the Amazon, before the Spanish, Portuguese came, had a much higher population. They had urban areas, they had permanent cultivation, as well as what Darrell called nomadic agriculture. He used the term nomadic agriculture. There's a very broad spectrum of land uses, and they're able to support a very high population, which is higher actually even than in the present day. They had roads, they had all sorts. There's much more going on than the Portuguese found in Brazil when they got there, because already the decimation by pioneering Portuguese bringing their diseases from Europe actually killed a lot of people before more people came to colonize and settle these lands. Now, Philippe Descola, who's this French a French anthropologist, he's got a very a really wonderful book. It's a lot of effort to read. Actually, it's very dense. But he did work in Ecuador, the Achuar. He said for the Achuar, for the forest with diversity of plants, a sort of giant botanical garden. It's not just a forest; it is a botanical garden that meticulously tended by Shakaim, a timid and unprepossessing spirit, the name of the spirit. This segment of the world, which evolves and develops independently from human norms, we usually call nature, is not for the Achuar a mere object to be socialized, but the ubiquitous subject of social relations. So they're like social forests, in which the forest contains kin beyond the human and is infused with the spirituality. It is very much for them our culture. In a sense, for them, there's no such thing as nature, right? So to say ask the question, what is a cultural landscape or the natural landscape? This is a sort of meaningless question, right? For them, as it is for many others around the world. Now that's Amazon. I thought I like to compare the Amazon Australia. One, because I've had an interest in Amazon since my 20s for a long, and that was a long time ago. But also Australia, I went there last year for 6 weeks, University of Queensland, and there's a very interesting debate, which is not very different from the debate that you have in the Amazon. So this is this gentleman on the left it's called Bruce Pascoe, and he wrote a book called Dark Even. Now, what is he saying? He argues that before the British colonized Australia, he shows that Indigenous Australians practice all sorts of advanced landscape management techniques. They practice agriculture. They had, fairly urbanized centers. And so in a way, he's trying to make a claim that their culture and livelihoods were much more diverse and much more sophisticated. They were not just hunters and gatherers. Now, why was that politically important? One is because they were disparaged for so long and treated as being primitive. But, and this is a really important point to make, behind this so-called ontological totalitarianism against many of these people is that they're assumed to be so backward they never had permanent agriculture. And if you go back to the 18th century, if not actually further back, in Europe and in my part of Europe, in Britain, and of course we were a major colonizer, but other parts of Europe as well, there was this idea that in order this idea that humans advanced through stages. You start off with hunting and gathering, then you keep livestock, and then you become farmers. And farmers is the step, the essential step to being civilized. Now, so he said, look, that they were farmers too. Now, the book was opposed by these two people, Sutton and Kenwell, saying basically his evidence is largely unreliable, and there's no real evidence that they had anything like agriculture at all. Okay, now I'm not in a position to say who's right and who's wrong here, but I think a very interesting criticism that could be made of Bruce Pascoe, is to say, in a sense, he's falling. Well, this is the criticism, and I sort of just let me say it, and then we can think about it afterwards. But if you say they deserve respect because they had agriculture, well, if it turns out that what they had actually didn't have agriculture, then it rather implies, well, in a sense, you're falling into this trap of saying you have to have agriculture in order to be civilized. Right? But actually, you can have a complex society where there is no permanent agriculture, permanent farms. And that's a really important point to make. And of course, all this work on certification shows that even if you didn't actually cultivate on farmlands in a permanent sense, even if you did, you still transformed the landscape in a way. You still did actually domesticate the landscape. You made that landscape better in order for you to, I mean, they lived there. They've lived there for 60,000 plus years. So it's something they're doing right, because it's not, Australia is not an easy place to live in unless you live on the coast. If you live inland, it's dry. It's a very difficult place. So somehow they've been able to do this for 60,000 years actually continuously. Right? So something they're doing must work. We might say it's a harsh life. But they've been resilient enough to make the best of a difficult sort of deal. Now, that first quotation I showed you by Rhys Jones, he actually came up with this phrase called fire stick farming. And what it is about the Aboriginal people is that they are very smart users of fire. They use fire in order to certain plants to sprout. It causes certain seeds to break open. So fire has certain landscape management uses. And of course, Australia, like other countries, like you also had in Greece as well, tragically have problems of fires, forest fires in very hot weather. And the argument here is that Aboriginal people they did controlled so-called cold burnings, or they would have limited burnings, and that would mean that if you have these limited fires, then you aren't going to have these big fires that are very, very, very devastating. So they actually are very smart users of fire. In fact, people who keep livestock now in what we might call modern agriculture in Australia say actually they were right about certain things. Actually, we can learn quite a lot from them. So whether or not they were, farmers in the way we understand the word, perhaps it is not shouldn't really matter that much. Okay, now of course, when the British came, when my ancestors came there, we said, well, there's no one here really, so-called terra nullius, the Latin term, land of nobody or nothing. Now, from the perspective of the Aboriginal people, of course, well, we've been here for 60,000 years into UK. Of course, it is occupied and settled. The fact that we're not there all the time, we move around, has nothing to do with this. We are definitely there. And this is the map of this part of Australia, the south east of Australia, from Melbourne in the south to Brisbane in the north of that map. You see all the different nations, you might say, the different indigenous nations, quite a lot there. All right, and when you meet indigenous people with the ones that I met who they have law degrees. I have a friend, she's indigenous and she is a lawyer. She does lots of really good work supporting indigenous people and others, and they'll tell you I may be so we're we're Julie on my father's side, and maybe Waka Waka on my mother's side. So they always say because, and when you meet an Aboriginal person, it's quite polite to ask them, so what's your country? What's your country? And I'll say, well, we're a jury from a particular place, and I'll say that's my ancestral home. So what's your country? It's a normal question to ask. And they'll very happily tell you where they're from, and that connection with country is incredibly important for them. It's a part of their identity. Now, so basically, the English, British sort of helped themselves basically to this land, and then in 1992 you had this really interesting court decision, and this was the Mabo decision, 1992, which overturned Territoriality and basically said that the land rights of these peoples were not extinguished upon colonization. That when the British colonized and imposed their law, that didn't extinguish the existing rights, and that's a really important case to be made. And Mabo, well, Eddie Mabo, he was not Aboriginal Indigenous. He was from the north of Queensland, some islands called the Torres Strait Islands. And what's interesting about the Torres Strait Islanders is that unlike the Aboriginal people, they actually do keep. They do actually have gardens. They are gardeners essentially, so they have their own plots of land. And it's an interesting question of supposing an Aboriginal people had made this case, would they have won? The Torres Strait Islanders are the real farmers of the Indigenous people. So if he hadn't been a farmer, would he have won the case? And I don't know the answer to that question, and no one else does. But it's an interesting question to ask. Okay, so I just got. Oh yeah, so that's Rhys Jones, who I mentioned to you. He actually posed this question: supposing that he wasn't from a farming community, even a gardening community, would he have actually won the case? And he doesn't know. Okay, that's a nice picture of the drawings that were used, presented, I think, to the court at the time, showing these bounded farmlands. That's nothing like most other Indigenous people. They don't have these boundaries like this. Okay, so now. So I should maybe in a bit of order. I'll come to those in a minute. So in the year after, Australia passed the Native Title Act, which allowed Aboriginal people to claim title to their land. Okay. Now, in terms of evidence, this becomes quite difficult because you have to show that your group has a connection with a particular area of land for a period going back to the time of the British invasion. So you have to show you have a connection for more than 200 years. How do you produce evidence? What evidence can you provide to show that you've occupied this land for more than 200 years? Well, this is quite interesting. So what kind of factual basis might be admissible? Well, you have to provide facts that might support the assertion that you had this association, I just said, but there exist traditional laws acknowledged by and customs observed by the claim group. So you have to show that you have actually those traditional laws. And that, as I said a few times now, law is completely related to land. So law that relates to that particular area of land. And that has continued for over 200 years. Well, now here it gets rather difficult because, of course, these people have been massively disrupted by 200 years of colonization. They've been massive. So how do they show they've maintained that link, having these laws which are still in use and have been for over 200 years? That becomes a problem. So in a way, it sounds very well-meaning, but in actual practice, it's been very difficult, and not as many land claims have been successful as you might think. So now I'm going to finish talking soon, but this is interesting because this is a large painting, an enormous painting And this painting is essentially not just a painting. It is also, and actually painting on cloth, but it is also part of a land claim, because in a way it is a kind of map. It's actually it is an artwork. It's also a map, and they're using it as a land claim. Now, what's also interesting is that they say this is a sort of representation of land, and therefore it is a representation of land is itself part of land. Now that sounds completely bizarre to us, but they say a representation of land is itself land. Okay, there's some more detail here. I'm happy to share these slides if anyone is interested. Okay, so I'll finish in just a minute. Okay, so I just wanted to talk very briefly about a copyright case where this issue comes up. Now, this was a case where an artist, an Aboriginal artist, he painted that picture on the left, which is called Magpie Geese and Water Lilies by the Waterhole. And this is not just an interesting painting. It actually represents a particular place that is part of the creation stories of those people. Right? Now, what happened is a company made copies, I think, on T-shirts of this artwork. So the artist, he sued for copyright infringement, and he won. Okay, it wasn't controversial. But what's interesting is that the landowners who were Aboriginal said, look, we are the owners of the land. In a sense, the image of land is land. Therefore, we also have an ownership interest. And of course, the court said no, because copyright is about art and literature. Land law is completely separate. So the two have nothing to do with each other. So, of course, here you have an example of the way that the imposed legal system makes a dualism between law in relation to protecting IP rights in art and literature here, and there land law that's a completely separate. Native title is not about copyright. Now, of course, those of you, us who have learned this area of law will say, well, of course, the judge is absolutely correct. But in a sense, going back one last time to my ontological totalitarianism thing, we are actually imposing an ontology on people for whom, just as we would find their view very hard to understand, why would you expect them to find our view any easier to understand? So their claim only sounds absurd if we adhere so much to our ontology that we are unable to look outside it and see it from their perspective. Okay, so what I'm arguing is that we need to get better at seeing things from their perspective, and we don't do as well as we should do. So just to finish off, perhaps a better way to embed IP rights is to go to this declaration of 2007, which in many ways I think reflects much more their sort of indigenous people's point of view. And Article 31, I think, I said at the beginning about the desire to have control over everything that emanates from land. And I think Article 31 here of the Declaration captures much better what they are demanding, what they would like to get from us, than any WIPO or convention of the kind that might well be agreed at the end of this week. Okay, so this point, I think I will stop. I've probably talked a bit too long, Statis.
Thank you so much, Graham, for this very insightful talk and very rich. So there is a lot of work already done there. So it's an excellent topic, as you have just showed us. We have some time for a couple of questions from the audience. We have already a comment and also a question in the chat. Kang Zhuang is writing the concept of landscape, Chinese, the classic of poetry, saying that all land under heaven is the territory of the sovereign. For Chinese culture, understanding the land is belonged to the son of the god in Zhou dynasty. We use the term of indigenous people to describe minorities in Chinese territory and land.
Okay.
Chinese people includes Han peoples and 56 minorities in mainland China. How does China think the notion of landscape related to traditional knowledge and PGR?
Okay, thank you. Let me first respond to what from Elena. Yeah, she's called Teresa Miller. Teresa Miller. I think it's I'll just put it in Teresa Miller, and the book's called Plant Kin. There we are. Okay. Okay. Well, about China, yeah. Okay. Well, China is certainly different. So the idea, the idea all land under heaven is a territory of the sovereign is something that well, that's China, and I don't think obviously we have we still have a monarchy in this country, in my own country, but I don't think we would say that all land is a territory of the king. Well, maybe we'll say that, but no one really believes it, I don't think. I hope not anyway. That's interesting. I don't know really how to respond to that, but say that's interesting. But I think, I understand that Chinese people don't use the term indigenous peoples. But the point is, I don't think I think that's okay. But I think it's important that China doesn't say that others can't use this term in other countries. And that's an important thing to say. That's a Chinese way, which is fine. But there are other ways to look at this. And the reason why we use this term indigenous peoples is because they have been colonized peoples, and they choose to use this term for as part of their political fight for self-determination. So basically, it's a useful concept for those, but obviously it doesn't apply everywhere. I mean, it's particularly used, I think, in North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, in some Asian and African places a little bit, but nowhere near as much. Also Scandinavian, you have the Sami in Scandinavia as well. They're very keen to use this. Yes.
Sophia, and then Odysseus.
Talk. It was a pleasure. I just a comment on the monoculture of the mind and ontological totalitarianism. I think these are really interesting and important concepts. Well, my background is in philosophy of science and feminist epistemology and all that. So, of course, science with what you're saying here. So that's just a comment. Also on this concept of nature cultures, and so there's a lot of feminist thinking that I think resonates with what you're doing. I was wondering about this concept of the land for indigenous people, and if actually it's the same concept as we might be using in English or amongst ourselves, because I was thinking about the concept of space instead. That, I mean, because you claimed any representation of land is land. And I was thinking, well, actually, maybe actually any representation of space is space. I mean, that might make more sense to me, like metaphysically or philosophically. thinking about that. So I was thinking about this concept of land and how concrete it is in terms of like physical land, or is it space or be, you know, a kind of like dimension of being that
Yes.
that's perhaps like spatial in some way. Yeah, so I was really fascinated by that and you know,
Okay.
polyvectoring my mind.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's not an easy answer to this one. First, let me just say that, of course, the way that different peoples frame their demands, certain words they use, but of course they will have their own sort of meanings, which might be a little bit different. I know in Australia they use the word country a lot.
Okay.
And country means perhaps not exactly the same as if you look in the Oxford English Dictionary. It may not be exactly the same. I think it has other, well, it means those things plus other things as well. But country also means, homeland and things like this. So it has a wider cultural meaning. So of course they, in Australia, particularly because it's English language country, so I can see how they use certain words in a way that is a little bit sort of different. They also use this word mob, M-O-B, mob, which sounds in a way like, we talk about mobs in the street who are rioting and breaking the law, but they mean mob, I think, like gang but actually in a way it is a sort of kinship group, but they use the word mob. So they take English words and they sort of use it a little bit differently. So when it comes to land and territory, I remember when I used to talk to Daryl Posey. Unfortunately, he died in 2001. I thought sometimes wish he was still around to talk about these things now, because he'd be such a wise man now, sort of much more than me. But he's not. So, but he used to talk a lot about the word territory, because he implied territory is actually a better word than land, because territory does imply it's not just about the surface of the land, because often we talk about territory in relation to sovereignty. Sovereign. We don't say sovereign land. We say sovereign territory. We say rights are, the law is territorial. Means it's kind of it's not national. It's bounded. So territory perhaps might be a better word than land, because territory is not just about topography and surface. It's about what lies beneath and what's up. And when you talk about sovereignty and sovereignty claims, then claims are made in terms are often expressed in a sort of cultural way, which often embodies a sense of sort of relationship between people and territory, and perhaps land doesn't necessarily do that. Word doesn't do that quite so well. That it's emphasised that sort of sense of connection, perhaps. Yeah. Okay, sorry, and not a great answer, but it's I think it's important that we understand that different groups don't have exactly the same demands, and they choose to express their demands in not always the same way. And of course, I showed that Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that is really a sort of compromise document, and it's been interesting because I used to go to these meetings, and you get Indigenous people from from the north of Sweden, meeting with Indigenous peoples from Peru, from the mountains, and rainforest people. And I know that in Peru and Bolivia, sometimes you get a bit of a conflict between the people, the mountain people, and the people in the rainforest. They have some conflicts about they don't necessarily see eye to eye completely either, So, and they chose again to frame their demands in slightly different ways, but they all have that sense of connection with territory. That's not different, but it's they have different interests, different demands, and of course, in the highlands of Peru, they are farmers, and they really do have permanent farms. we go back to hundreds. Well, of course, those farmers did domesticate the potato, so they're involved in the early domestication of crop plants. Now, what's interesting, actually, it's interesting that some domestication also took place in the Amazon rainforest too. I think manioc, cassava was domesticated actually in I think in rainforest. So, so they're not entirely different. But in terms of if you are a farming community and you're a group in the Amazon who may do some cultivation, you may do some hunting, some gathering. They tend to switch to back and forth quite a lot. Sort of livelihoods are like a sort of Swiss Army knife. You take one blade out and it's useful for something, and you put it back and do something else. And so they're quite flexible in terms of livelihoods. Obviously their connection with land is going to be a bit different, and also their how they explain to others what matters to them. But that point I made at the beginning, that actually what they demand is territory or land. Right? I said land, but maybe I should say territory. But control over what emanates from that, both tangible and intangible. And I think that is probably, they would all nod their heads. I think, I can't speak for them, but I suspect they would nod their heads. The meetings that I've been to, that they would say, yeah, well, that's exactly what we are. That's what we want.
Thank you, Graham. There is one more question, the last one by Odysseas Kanelopoulos. Odysseas, please move on.
Hello. So my question is, what is the solution to such a convoluted matter? I mean, okay, it's a difficult question, maybe an impossible question, but how do you unite such antiphatic worldviews? We're not just talking about Amazon tribes that are disconnected from modern society. We're talking about indigenous people who live with us in the same society, with us in the same society. So to make the question a bit more clear, what decision should the judge make?
Okay. Right, the answer. Okay, first, well, what is the solution? I think actually we don't have solutions, right? In a sense, there's not an answer to this, but there are, I think, better ways to do things, right? And I think, and I'll come back to the second question, Emma. Is what I think is really important, that is that we have better ways of working together, of actually cooperation is the way to go. Now, I'll give you an example. When I was in Australia, so there's a project, University of Queensland, between scientists who are trained in food nutrition. Okay, so and I went to their lab, and the woman in charge of this lab is the PhD in sort of food nutrition science, and they're doing all sorts of interesting work, and they're working actually with Indigenous people, right? Because these people, they use a lot of I don't know if you come across the phrase "the hidden harvest." So there are lots of plants that are used, which have interesting sort of nutritional, they provide sort of micro, what do they call them, nutrients, which are very good for diets. These are plants that are probably collected. They may be either semi-domesticated, not really sure, but they use certain plants that are, as you know, we all kind of rely on a relatively narrow spectrum of foods. We're dependent on the main food crops of the main wheat and rice and maize and potatoes and a few other things. But there are lots of really interesting plants. But of course, they don't have much money, and even though they have knowledge of these plants, which are not well known, they know how to prepare these plants. So of course, it's about survival, subsistence, rather than. So they've been working together. Aboriginal people go and to the lab people going out to the communities, and they are, it's mutually advantageous work. They're introducing new plants to them, showing how they prepare them, and it's important to note that food preparation by those people is actually can be extremely actually beneficial for consumers. For example, we know that that manioc, certain forms of manioc are very toxic. They've known for a long time how to actually remove the toxins from manioc. And of course, manioc is a plant that came from, I think, the Amazon, but it's grown in Africa, around the world. But how to actually make it safe for humans to eat, that was discovered by people, the ancestors of Indigenous peoples today. All right, so that's and they're also interested in branding and commercialization of some of these food products, because they don't know how to sort of standardize and do all the necessary labeling and all this kind of thing, and get regulatory approval. So there's expertise on both sides. So I think we need to understand that expertise is not just from one side, and there's sort of respectful collaborations. It's something. I don't have a solution that's overnight, but these is incremental ways to do things better. Now, in terms of what could the judge do, well, the judge has no choice. That is the law in Australia. It's copyright law. That is the way it is. There have been cases where the judges have been creative. Judges see an injustice. They can see that one party is dissatisfied and they are sympathetic. They've used other areas of English law actually and applied it in quite imaginative ways. So there are ways to do it within the law, but there's a bigger question of the extent to which customary law can be used in courts. We have we have certain disputes in my own country that are settled by there are Jewish communities, also Muslim communities, who settle their own disputes. So whether that's a good thing or not is another matter. But the fact is, there are dispute settlements that can be made by communities under their own laws in quite a lot of countries. So are there grounds to be more pluralistic in our laws? Possibly yes. I mean, the fact that the Native Title Act does actually accept Indigenous law as evidence for a land claim goes to show that there is some flexibility that is possible, and maybe a bit more flexibility might lead to perhaps a better compromise, so that without necessarily suddenly applying Indigenous law, some kind of hybrid acceptance of principles from other legal traditions in that particular jurisdiction might actually lead to fair results. And if you tell people your law sort of means nothing, it doesn't encourage them to be respectful to the laws that are imposed on them. And I think if you want to have a more I mean, it's important that we do have laws that we can respect. And I think respect for law is a really important thing for social cohesion. So you have to have laws that are sort of legitimate and these are the communities who live there for 60,000 years. I think they have a reasonable claim to a bit more flexibility at the very least. Sorry, quite a long answer there. It's a good question.
We have I have a request for one more very quick question by Eliana. Eliana, please move on.
Hello, thank you for your talk. I'd like to ask if within the current legal framework there is a recognized duty to disclose advantageous information from the side of, let's say, scientists towards Indigenous populations about traditional knowledge.
Yeah, so you're asking whether are you saying that ought to be an obligation, or what, to disclose?
Yeah, for example, if there is a plan for a certain project that would have an economic advantage.
Yeah, well, I think
Whatnot.
one of the difficulties is to actually build trust. So when I mentioned that I give that example of that group in Australia and the university, and they had to go and build trust. Obviously, in some ways there are both sides have information that can be valuable to the others, and of course that happens. I mean, in a sense, that's very common. That you have two parties who know something that the other knows. How do you? I mean, often we do that through contract law. We sort of have contracts. Licensing is how it's done in business. But of course, the problem is that that's how we do things. And contract law tends to be sort of impersonal, right? It's impersonal. There was an old legal historian called Henry Maine who came up with this phrase from status to contract, where the law used to be about it was very social in the sense that it was done through relations, and it's done through contract law. Contract law is impersonal; it's arm's length. And when I've heard people talking on the Indigenous side, they say, look, we want to build relationships. We don't want people to come in, sign a contract, and then disappear and take something. It's about building relationships. But of course, we're often business is too impatient. They don't want to do that, build relationships. But you do that, and you can have very good sharing of knowledge, information, and it can be very constructive. And both sides feel they're both happy with this. So yeah, I mean, in terms of obligations on the stronger party, that's perhaps in a sense what this treaty is going to be about. The one in Geneva is about requiring patent applications to disclose knowledge that was people's knowledge that was used to come up with the invention. So it's meant to solve that problem, although, I'm not entirely optimistic it would make a big difference, to be honest, but okay.
Okay, thank you, Graham. That has been a really nice seminar. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. And above all, thank you, Graham, for giving such an insightful seminar.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you, everybody. And there will be 2 more seminars for this rounds, and there will be relevant announcements and advertisements. Thank you so much, everybody. Goodbye. Thank you, Graham. Bye.
Bye. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.